Hello and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, we are going to explore the mysterious and mischievous world of fairy gold. Yes, fairy gold. We are going to look at some accounts of people who have discovered vast riches that have appeared seemingly from nowhere, only to discover that with great wealth comes a great big catch. These are stories where fortunes are fickle, and one false move could mean that not only do you lose all of your money, you could lose a lot more as well. And so, to begin at the beginning. And it's been a while since I've discussed the fairy folk on this podcast. I've neglected the Tylwyth Teg, as they are known in Wales, for quite a while now, and I'm going to make up for that on this episode. And another figure I've slightly neglected recently is William Shakespeare. And there's no better way to kick off an episode than with a quote from the bard himself. And in The Winter's Tale, specifically Act 3, Scene 3, the old shepherd says, and apologies to any Shakespearean actors listening in advance because I'm about to massacre this quote from William Shakespeare, but the old shepherd says, "This is fairy gold, boy, and 'twill prove so. This is fairy gold, boy, and 'twill prove so." So the old shepherd believes they have fairy gold, and he tells the boy to gather it and to rush home as quickly as possible, adding, "We are lucky, boy, and to be so still requires nothing but secrecy." And that is the key line. To be so still requires nothing but secrecy. And what that means, if you aren't up on your Shakespeare, or if you're struggling with my fantastic Shakespearean reciting skills, but what the old shepherd is saying in that quote is that this unexpected windfall, this gold they've come into, this magical gold, should be gathered up quickly and taken home for safekeeping before anyone sees it. So there's this idea in Shakespeare's writing, as there has been for centuries and centuries, that fairy gold is something precious, it's something mysterious, and it's something that other people might want so badly they will steal it from you, and it needs to be kept secret. And the implication here in Shakespeare, as with folklore, is that fairy gold is something that people will do anything to take from you. And I'm sure even if you are a very honest person, if someone dangles fairy gold in front of you, you will be tempted, much like Gollum, to steal that precious gold. It might be beyond your willpower, it might drive you to unimaginable ends, but people will try and claim that gold, and it's your job to keep it as secret as possible. And that is the reason we've started this episode with that particular Shakespearean quote, not just because I like Shakespeare, but because, in a nutshell, it reflects what the peasantry, and specifically the Welsh peasantry for this episode, what they thought about fairy gold and fairy money. Because, according to Victorian folklore at least, the Welsh peasantry saw fairy gold as something magical to be coveted, to be secretive about, to hoard, much like a dragon, which keeps the Tolkien theme going nicely. But fairy gold is something to keep hush-hush about, to keep it under lock and key. Because folklore tells us that, to quote, "Fairy money is as good as any, so long as its source is kept a profound secret." So what that means is, if you find a big stash of fairy money in the forest or wherever it might be that you're wandering and you come across it, as long as you don't tell anyone where it came from, you can spend it just like any other kind of cash and live the high life. However, if you tell anyone, if the finder, we are told, relates the details of their good fortune, it will vanish. And that is the end of the instructions. It's that easy. It's that straightforward. If you tell someone, "Hey, look at this big stash of gold I just found sitting there in the forest in a puff of smoke, or maybe not even that, maybe in a puff of nothing. It will just be gone. As quickly as you found it, it will disappear, it will vanish. So secrecy is key when dealing with fairy gold. For two reasons, or at least two reasons, which are, firstly, it will drive the people around you mad with jealousy to the extent they will follow you to Mordor to get it back from you. And secondly, it will vanish if you whisper a word about it. And if that wasn't enough of a warning, sometimes, especially in cases where the money has been spent, the evil result of tattling, we are told, and tattling, if you aren't familiar with it, is an old-fashioned way of saying snitching or dishing the dirt. The evil result of tattling is that you will get no further favours for tattlers. So that means not only will you lose the money that you'd already found and stashed away, you will get no more money in the future either. And I guess you could call that a third reason then. We now have 3 reasons for keeping your mouth shut if you find that fairy gold. And actually, it's not just gold, because we are told that these laws, these rules apply to all fairy gifts of all kind, not just financial. So if you get anything from the fairies, they could clean your house, they could milk your cow, they could order you a pizza. Whatever they do, if you tell anyone about them, loose lips sink ships, as the saying goes. I'm sure that probably applies to fairies as well. But if you whisper a word, no more favours for you. And in one such tale, which I'll be honest is quite a bizarre one, even for Welsh folklore, even for this podcast, there's been a lot of bizarre tales over the years, but according to a Breconshire legend, the local Tylwyth Teg were, or are, maybe they're still there for all I know, but they certainly were very generous. And they would give the peasantry loaves of bread, which is nice of them, free bread for all the peasantry. However, and this is where things take a turn for the bizarre, however, the bread would turn into toadstools the next morning. The bread would turn into toadstools the next morning. And in order to avoid this, it was necessary to eat the bread in darkness and silence to avoid this transformation. So if you like eating bread at night, in the darkness, in silence, you're in luck. But if you like eating bread whilst having a conversation in the daytime, I guess, your bread will turn into toadstools, which is a strange twist on the whole secretive aspect of this folklore, because you're not losing wealth as such, you're merely having your bread switched to toadstools. I mean, if you like toadstools, if you prefer toadstools to bread, this is great. I mean, tell the world, tell everyone you'll be drowned in toadstools, but it's quite an odd, quite a bizarre spin on the rules of the fairy folk. And to move on to another example, what is described as a picturesque example of the fairy folk's rules in action, is the tale of Gitto Bach, a lovely Welsh name. Gitto, spelt in this example Gitto, could also be Guto, Bach, Bach, which means Little Griffith. And Little Griffith, Gitto Bach, was a good little farmer's boy of Glamorganshire, who used to often ramble to the top of the mountain to look after his father's sheep. On his return, he would show his brothers and sisters pieces of remarkably white paper, like crown pieces with letters stamped upon them, which to my mind sounded a little bit like fake money, like someone's made money out of bits of paper. And he said they were given to him by the little children with whom he played with on the mountain. The little children he played with on top of that mountain. And you don't need to be a Victorian folklorist to put 2 and 2 together here and think maybe, just maybe, these little children he's playing with and receiving gifts from on top of a remote Welsh mountain might not be exactly what they seem. And that is almost confirmed in the next line of the story, where things take a turn for the worst very, very quickly, because we are simply told that he would play with them on the mountain, and one day he did not return. Straight and to the point, he would often come down and talk about them, but on this particular day he did not return. And for 2 years, nothing was heard of him. Nothing was heard of Gitto Bach. Meanwhile, other children occasionally found similar pieces of paper with the crown stamped on them on the mountain. Now, it doesn't specify if they were given these by little children, as with Gitto, or whether they were just finding these pieces of paper. But nevertheless, the paper continued even though Gitto was no longer there, until one morning when Gitto's mother opened the door, there he sat, the truant, dressed exactly as he was when she saw him last 2 years before. And the implication here is that Gitto hasn't changed in all that time. In those 2 years, he looks exactly the same. I don't think it's a comment on his personal hygiene or anything like that. I don't think it's suggested he's been a slob in the same clothes for 2 years. Rather, he just looks identical to when he was seen last. Although there was one noticeable difference. Under his arm was a small bundle. He was holding a small bundle, and his mother asked him, "Where in the world have you been all this time?" To which, quoth Gitto, I don't get to use the word quoth very often on this podcast, so I'm going to use it again. Quoth Gitto, we've had Shakespeare, now we're drifting off into Edgar Allan Poe territory. But in reply to his mother's question, Gitto said, "Why? It was only yesterday I went away." And opening up that bundle, he said, "Look at these pretty clothes the children gave me on the mountain for dancing with them to the music of their harps." And they looked inside that bundle, and there was indeed what is described as a handsome dress inside. He had been given a handsome dress. However, it was made entirely from paper, like the fairy money. And the suggestion here is that Gitto clearly doesn't understand or hasn't been told the rules of dealing with fairy money and fairy gifts. He's been telling everyone as soon as he gets these things. And that is why when he used to come down from the mountain with bits of white paper and told people about it, the suggestion is maybe that was fairy money until he opened his mouth. And in this case, after returning from dancing with them seemingly for 2 whole years, he tells his mother about the wonderful clothing they've given him. And as he does so, he opens that bundle and all that's inside is paper. So let that be a lesson to you, a warning to you, that if you do get kidnapped by fairies, or maybe you join them voluntarily, but if after 2 years they reward you with some fancy clothing or some money or some other gift of note, don't tell anyone, or that gift might soon be nothing more than worthless paper. Although our folklorist does tell us that the most common result of blabbing, opening your mouth about the fairy folk, is a simple discontinuation. He tells us across Wales, if you speak, they will simply cut you out of the action. The worst that you can expect to happen under normal circumstances if you tell anyone is that they will simply give you no more going forward. So not so much a punishment, but you do spoil it for your future self. Your future self is going to miss out on goodies, but hopefully, fingers crossed, there's no other negative effects. But a legend connected with a bridge in Anglesey, good old Ynys speaks of a lad who often saw the fairies there and profited by their generosity. And we are told that every morning, while going to fetch his father's cows from pasture, he saw them. The fairy folk, not the cows. Well, both. He saw them. And after they were gone, he always found a groat. And a groat is a coin, presumably quite a valuable coin to a lad of this description. And he found it on a particular stone on Cymunod Bridge. So this boy, every day would go to get the cows for his father over this bridge in Ynys Môn and would find a groat. And as I'm sure you can imagine, his father did start to get a little bit suspicious that his son had all this money, maybe even more money than he was earning. And we are told that the boy's having money so often about him excited his father's suspicion. And one Sabbath day, he cross-questioned the lad as to the manner in which it was obtained. And I'm sure where you can all see where this is going, the father has asked him, where is this money coming from? Is he going to tell him the truth? Well, we are told that, oh, the meddlesomeness of fathers. Of course, the poor boy confessed that it was through the medium of the fairies. He told him it was the Tylwyth Teg. And of course, though he often went afterwards to the field where he saw them, he never found any money on the bridge, nor saw the offended Tylwyth Teg again, which is quite a telling description. He never saw the offended Tylwyth Teg again. Their favour was lost. So that's a more straightforward tale. That one, there's very much a cause and effect. Keep your mouth shut and the fairies will look after you. If you open your mouth and tell people, they will cut you adrift. You are on your own. You are no longer part of the gang. And maybe that's one thing that Welsh fairy folk share in common with the mafia, which is a comparison I never thought I'd make. I imagine I'm the first person to compare the Welsh Tylwyth Teg to the mafia. But if you find a horse's head in your bed, and we do like our horses' heads in this part of the world. I'm recording this in January, which is Mary Lloyd season. So not so much a horse's head. If you find a horse's skull in your bed, maybe that's a sign that the Welsh fairy mafia have got their eyes on you. And anyway, I'm not entirely sure where I'm going with this tangent, so let's get this episode back on track. Let's reel things back in and wrap things up with one more story, a final story which does share similarities to our last tale. And it concerns a young woman called Anne William Francis. And it takes place in the parish of Baseleg, which I'm assuming is Baseleg in the county of Newport in the southeast of Wales. And we are told that Anne William Francis went out late one night into a grove of woods near the house. And it already sounds a little bit ominous. What is she doing? Going out late at night in the dark to a grove of woods. Well, it was there that she heard music, which is described as pleasant music, and saw a company of fairies dancing on the grass. I'm sure you can picture the scene. There they are, under the moonlight. Well, I like to think they're under the moonlight. That isn't specified in the text, but it's my podcast. They're under the moonlight. A gang of fairies dancing to pleasant music. And thinking it would gratify them, she took a pail of water with her, which is a nice gesture. You know, I'm sure she thought, it's thirsty work, all this dancing, they'll appreciate something to drink at the end. And it seems to have pleased them. It seems to have done the trick, because the next time she went there, she received a shilling. So, as mentioned, a bit like the last story, she has been rewarded financially. It appears she has found money. And it wasn't a one-off, because we are told that so she found for several nights after, until she had 21 shillings, which put in my maths GCSE to the test here, but that would suggest she returned for 21 nights in a row. And while I have no idea what that is in today's money, as with our previous tale again, it's a sizable chunk that I'm sure would have made this person feel like a queen. But, and there's always a but her mother, it's always a nosy parent, but her mother, happening to find this money, questioned her as to where she had received it. Now, at first, and this is where things do differ from the last story, this girl quite sensibly stood her ground and didn't tell. She didn't just blurt it out. But we are told her mother got severe on her, and by severe, threatened to beat her. She confessed she got the money from the fairies. And that, as they say, was that. She had opened her mouth, she had spoken about the fairy mafia, and whether you blame her, whether you blame the mother, surely the mother should have known better, should have known about the laws of the fairy folk. Either way, the damage was done. And as a result, surprise, surprise, after that, the fairy folk never gave her any more shillings. And as something of an epitaph to that tale, to all of the tales actually, we're going to end on a theory that, frankly, is something of a downer for a Victorian folklorist to be suggesting. But they have a theory about this fairy gold, this fairy money. And they say that while you've heard a few examples on this episode, they've heard many, many more tales where people have received sometimes silver sixpences, most commonly copper coin. But whatever money people receive, whether it's a groat, whether it's a shilling, whether it's silver, whether it's copper, these fairies themselves do not have the ability to make money, magically or otherwise. They do not have their own mint with which to create money. Therefore, where does this money come from? Well, our folklorist tells us that certainly it must be money lost or concealed by persons. And by persons here, they mean humans, people like me and you, who would hide our money, I'm assuming, back before banks were as reliable as they are today. So what the folklorist is suggesting here is that they believe when people are given fairy money, because fairies can't make this themselves, it must be money they've taken from elsewhere. So maybe somebody has been saving up all their lives and they decide to stash their life savings of copper coins in the forest somewhere. The implication is that the fairies then find these hidden stashes and give this money away to people who please them, whether they dance for them, sing for them, whatever it is. But if they take a liking to you, you will then benefit from this money they have seemingly stolen off other people. So this isn't generating new money, it is simply redistributing money. And I guess an economist could make an argument here that at least the fairies aren't upsetting the balance of the wealth in the world or something along those lines. But as I'm not, I won't. And I shall let you, dear listener, make up your own mind, because we have reached the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. And while that might be the end of the folklore for this episode, as it is the first episode of a new year, I did want to take a few minutes to give you a few updates on what I've been working on and what I will be working on, to look backwards and to look forwards, as it were. So the one big downer from the last 12 months, as long-term listeners will know, is that this podcast is currently once a month, or once every 4 weeks, which roughly works out as once a month, which is a shame. It used to be weekly, and then it was bi-weekly, and now it's once a month. And the reason for that has nothing to do with content, although I hate the word content, material. It has nothing to do with material I have years and years worth mapped out, ready to go. The simple, boring reason that it's once a month at the moment is I just haven't got the time. When I started this podcast during the COVID lockdowns, I was sitting around on furlough doing nothing all day, and I could quite easily record an episode a week. When the world went a little bit back to normal, that's when it went bi-weekly, and at the moment I am so up to my eyeballs in projects that it's once a month. And it's a shame, and I'd like to change that, but for the time being, we're going to stick to once a month. Now, the good news, I did mention there that I started this during the first COVID lockdown, and that means in a few months' time, we will be celebrating the 5th anniversary of this podcast, which I find incredible. How this has been going for 5 years is beyond me. But I will hopefully do something I will do something special to mark the 5th year anniversary. What? Watch this space. Subscribe to be sure you don't miss what I'm sure will be some epic celebration, but I will be doing something to mark that. Also, and I've hinted at this on previous episodes, but we've nearly, and I will explain we in a moment, but we've nearly wrapped up the first first episode in a very, very exciting documentary series that I've been working on with two very good friends, Steve Balsamo and Ant Jones. And I'm a little bit reluctant about how much I say or don't say at this stage, because we've been working very hard. We've driven up and down the country. We've interviewed some remarkable people. We've found some incredible sort of long lost bits of evidence and things in archives and stuff about cases that people haven't dared look at for decades and decades. So I'm really excited about getting that out into the world. What I can say at this stage is that wherever you are, I am sure everyone will be able to watch this. So don't worry about not being in Britain or something like that. We will make sure this is available worldwide. And I'm hoping by that 5th anniversary episode, we'll have some big reveals so I can tell you more about it. And the plan at the moment is that in the second half of the year, as we get closer to Halloween, I tend to do a lot more live events, a lot more talks and a lot more sign-ins and things. This year, the plan is to combine that with the documentary. So during the talk, we can do a little bit of looking behind the scenes and how our investigation worked, how we discovered this evidence, how we came to our conclusions, maybe even a bloopers reel, because there were some, let's say, curse words that haven't made the final edit. But that's all to be worked out. So it's all very exciting, and I'd love to spoil all the secrets right now, but I'm going to behave. I'm going to shut up about the documentary now. But the final word on that is that it's very, very exciting, and if you enjoy this podcast, you are going to love it. As for my books, I do have 2 new books which have been finished my end. They will be in the shops, one of them hopefully by the end of this year, the second one early next year. Those dates could change, but again, watch this space. And one of my very first books, which isn't particularly spooky, but a book called The Little Book of Welsh Landmarks, has been updated. It did need a radical updating. It's been updated, and the second edition of that is going to be published in the spring this year. So in 2025, I'm expecting there'll be at least one new book and one rehashed book. Well, I'm sure my publisher wouldn't appreciate the word rehashed. One lovingly updated book as well. I am sure I will shamelessly promote them if and when they reach the bookshelves. And I guess the only other thing to really say is to thank everyone for tuning in, whether you've been with me for the 5 years or whether this is your first episode. You are all very, very welcome. Thank you for being a part of this. If you'd like to say hello, send me a message, any suggestions, you can do so via social media. I'm active on most of the main social media platforms, or you can send me an email via my website. And as always, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can treat me to a coffee, also via my website, which all goes towards keeping this thing on the air, or you could just leave me a nice review or a thumbs up or whatever the options are for being nice on whatever platform you are listening to this on. Anyway, that's enough waffling on. Let's wrap things up. And it just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, if you do find a horse's skull in your bed, maybe the Tylwyth Teg want to make you an offer you can't refuse. Until next time, nos da.